Hello from the beach, everyone, and thank you for your understanding as we're working through this difficulty this week of me not being there. I appreciate your patience. I am going to continue to release videos to you over the course of the week. This first one's going to be on hills like white elephants. I've already written the script for the one on the yellow wallpaper and set up the Prezi for that, so that'll be coming to you tomorrow morning. And each morning, I'll be giving you a new video. No, I'm sorry, I'll be alternating between you and my other class. So every other day, you'll be getting a new video on a short story. And of course, I am available should you need anything via email, but expect a bit of a delay before I get back to you. But anyway, let's go ahead and talk about Hills Like White Elephants. So this is written by Ernest Hemingway, pretty heavy hitter in the literary world. You're seeing now on the screen a list of some of his notable novels. And it's not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the most famous ones that you've probably heard of. And while his novels are good, I actually prefer his short stories. And there's actually one nonfiction account of his time in Paris that he wrote later in his life called A Movable Feast. And it was published posthumously, and it's really it's a fantastic read. And the reason it was published after he died is because he says all these really terrible things about his friends, including F. Scott Fitzgerald, really embarrassing and terrible things. But if you enjoyed this story, then I suggest reading a lot of his other work, including A Movable Feast. So there's a picture of him when he was young. A World War I driver. His cats had 6 toes, and other less interesting things about him are listed below. So he was an outdoorsman. He loved hunting, he loved fishing, and just sort of rambling through the woods. Like I mentioned, he drove an ambulance in World War I and lived in Paris afterwards, along with a bunch of other expatriated authors. And the reason that so many of these artists and authors lived in Paris after the war was because of the financial crisis in Paris. The dollar was incredibly powerful, and so if you were paid in American money, which American soldiers were, then you could live in Paris for a year on about $30, $40. So a dollar could buy a month's worth of bread. So you can imagine how easy it would be to be an artist in this time. The original source of the information for this Prezi, apart from just personal history reading Hemingway, was the Longman Reader. And one of the things that it says about Hemingway is that being an outdoorsman, as he was, is at odds with him being an avid reader and writer, which is a really prejudiced statement, and I wanted to mention how it's not true at all, particularly for American authors. If you look at a lot of the famous American authors, especially males in the 20th century, you have many outdoorsmen. You've got lots of hunters and fishers and people who spend a lot of time out of doors. That bias is sort of a new thing. I'm not sure why. Hemingway did struggle with alcoholism and depression and ended up killing himself with the same gun that his father used to kill himself. The Longman Reader also said that his style was laconic, and that's true, but it's a really unnecessary word. It's kind of a stupid word. Basically, it's just succinct. He has this sort of curt, short style, lots of really choppy sentences. And not only does he have that style in his descriptions as he's writing, but also his dialogue tends to be that way as well. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he helped make literature what it is now. If you go back before Hemingway, and this is true of a lot of his contemporaries as well, the writing is very long, it's very flowing and sort of proper. He popularized the idea of sort of writing in a natural style. So any of the contemporary books that you read now that have that sort of conversational style, a lot of that is owed to Hemingway. Alright, so why does he matter? Well, one, because he helped popularize newer novels, and that's a really big deal, but also because he did that without sacrificing any of the literary quality. So he says about his own work on page 552 of the Longman Reader. He has this iceberg analogy that 7/8 of it is under the water for every part that shows. So you've got to put a lot of work into reading Hemingway, otherwise you're not going to catch all of what's going on. And because he had that, there's so much depth and so much you can study in his work. That, along with the conversational style, made that sort of acceptable for academics to study. So let's talk specifically about Hills Like White Elephants, because this is definitely one of those iceberg kinds of pieces. It was originally published in 1927, and you get two main characters, the American and Jig. This story is told almost exclusively through dialogue between the two, and though it's never mentioned directly, what they're talking about is whether or not Jig should get an abortion. They just call it the operation, and the American is really pushing for her to do that. So let's talk about abortion in the 1920s. It's not the same as it is today. It was an extremely dangerous procedure. We're talking sometimes life-threatening, oftentimes extreme pain or infertility. It was very poorly understood, and that's not to say that it's okay today or not okay today. It's not a political statement. All it is a statement about how in the 1920s to encourage someone to get an abortion is a statement that really shows you're not concerned for their overall well-being. Let's talk about Spain in the 1920s. So in the 1920s, this is post-World War I, and Hemingway did spend a lot of time in Spain. He was familiar with the Ebro Valley. It's unlikely that this is autobiographical to any degree, but he was probably familiar with a situation like this. If you have an American in Europe in the 20s, they probably fought in the war, and they probably never left, and they're living there off of money they made from the war. So it wasn't quite as bad in Spain as it was in France, but it was close. Excuse me. You didn't have to have a lot of money to do pretty well. Also, that the American is referred to as the American and Jig has a name lets us know that it's very likely that Jig is either from Spain or from some other European country and has met up with the American there. So this is what the Ebro Valley actually looks like, and you can see where it gets its name. The hills literally look like white elephants. And so there's some statement about whether or not the abortion is the elephant in the room, and that phrase was around then. But I tend to think that Hemingway is, with his title, at least a little more literal than that in this case. It's just this is what you're seeing. And if you ever had an awkward conversation with someone, like this conversation is in Hills Like White Elephants, there's not very much looking at each other, and so if they're at the train station having an awkward conversation, this is what each of them sees the entire time, and it's the image that he calls to mind for us with the title. So you can see here where the little A is. I'm pointing with my finger, which you can't see. That's where the Ebro Valley actually is. And there's Spain and the whole of Europe for the curious. Okay. So, the use of dialogue in this story to tell sort of what's going on is important because it helps to mask the overall meaning. If Hemingway had used a third-person narrator to tell us exactly what's going on, the story is really very short. And the more that you know from an omniscient standpoint, the less interesting it is. So it's because you don't know exactly what's going on at the beginning that makes this interesting. The pacing is also extremely important in this. They order 2 drinks over the course of 50 minutes, and they utter 2 pages worth of dialogue mixed in with description. So the pacing really tells us a lot about their relationship. They're not saying much. They're sitting there and they're mentioning something that neither of them wants to directly talk about back and forth over and over and over again. Alright, here are just a few discussion questions that I'd like you to think about at least. If we were in class, these are the kinds of things that we would be talking about. But I want you to just read through them, think on them, and then apply these questions not only to this story, the first 2 anyway, but also to the other stories we're going to read this week because they're relevant. If you want to get to these in some of your online discussion questions over the course of the week, that is totally fine. But that's Hills Like White Elephants, and hopefully that wasn't too long, and I will send you guys another video in 2 days. Again, please feel free to email me if you have any questions. Thanks.